Morning, everybody. Welcome to this virtual learning cafe on functional family therapy. We're just going to give it a minute or two. We're just letting lots of people into the room. And thank you for your patience. I know we're starting a couple of minutes late. We were just doing our technical check and making sure we had everything all ready. So we'll just give it another minute and then we'll make a start. Okay, let's get going. So welcome everyone. We're delighted that you're able to join us today. My name's Gail Gibbons. I'm Assistant Director of Change for Children's Services, Neighbourhoods and the Youth Sector at the Youth Endowment Fund. And I'm going to be chairing the session today. We've got some fabulous speakers who are going to be talking all about functional family therapy. To start with, we have Dr. Laura Knight, who is our head of Toolkit at the Youth Endowment Fund. And Laura will be talking through functional family therapy. What is it, for those of you that don't know? And also, what does the evidence tell us about it? And we'll leave a bit of time for any questions that you might have for Laura. Following Laura, we then have Raphael Cadenhead, who's FFT Programme Manager at Family Psychology Mutual. Raphael will be talking through the FFT programme itself, which is partway through delivery in 3 London boroughs. And finally, we then have Dr. Sajid, Humayun and Helen Downham from the University of Greenwich, who are evaluating the programme, and they'll be talking about their approach to evaluation, and then we'll be taking last questions as well. You all do have your cameras off, as you can tell, and also your mics off as well. If you have any question or comment as the presenters are presenting, please do put them in the chat. We really welcome an open and interesting dialogue, and then we'll pick them up either as we go or probably at the end of each session. The other thing just to say is that we are recording the session, and we will be uploading the recording to the Youth Endowment Fund website after the event, along with the presentation slides for you to have access to, and also for you to signpost any colleagues who might be unable to make today. As I said, we really welcome questions, so please don't be shy, and as well as putting things in the chat, we'll be giving opportunity for you to put your virtual hand up, and then we can bring you in to ask the question yourself. So I think that's probably all the housekeeping, so I'm going to pass over to Laura, who's going to do the first presentation. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Gail. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. I'm Laura Knight. I'm head of our Violence Prevention Toolkit for the Youth Endowment Fund. And so I'll just give you a really brief overview of the toolkit and a little intro to the Youth Endowment Fund for those of you that maybe haven't interacted with us before launching into the evidence that we have on functional family therapy when thinking about this as a programme and intervention focused on reducing violence and crime for children and young people. So the Youth Endowment Fund. So we're a charity set up in 2019 with an endowment from the Home Office and this really big, bold vision for a world where no child becomes involved in violence. And so the way that YEF wants to contribute to that vision is through really building the evidence base and putting that evidence into practice. And so we fund research and evaluation to really find out what works. And then we put that into products that are designed to be really easy for you to use, so that you can use that information to influence your decision making and the work that you do in protecting children's safety. And so one of those products is the toolkit that I'll introduce to you today, but we also have various guidance products, and we have change programs to really help make sure that the information that we find really does influence the way it is that we're working with children and young people and families. And so to start off, I thought it might be helpful to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So just a quick overview of functional family therapy. So this is a therapeutic intervention that's designed for children and their families, where the children are aged 10 to 17 or 10 to 18 for some programs. And this is about focusing on children that are displaying behavioural difficulties. And they might be at risk or already involved in antisocial behaviour, in violence, in crime. They might already be interacting with the police or with youth justice. And so this is about identifying children that have these behavioural difficulties, recognising where there's a family function that could be a causa or related to this behavioural difficulty that we're seeing. And the therapeutic intervention is really designed to improve the communication, the relationships between those family members, look at those family dynamics and see how is it that we could influence that family relationship to hopefully have an impact on reducing those behavioural difficulties that are putting children at risk of further involvement in crime, violence, or with the justice system. And so this is a really manualised programme delivered by therapists that have been trained specifically in functional family therapy. Often these therapists are trained at the level of masters or higher. And there's really, really specific levels of training and a specific programme to follow. Usually these programmes are delivered in somewhere between sort of 12 to 14 sessions, but when we had a look at the evidence, the delivery seems to vary from 8 sessions through to 30 sessions. Some programmes delivered a few more over this sort of 3 to 6 month period. So it's considered a really sort of intensive programme, but can be really quite short term. And so whilst the delivery is intense, the focus really is on that long-term change in family dynamics to influence long-term behaviour change for children. And something that really came through in our evaluations of how family therapy works is about, whilst we've got that really specific manualised programme, often therapists will be providing this out-of-hours support, which makes it quite different to some of the other services that our children and families might be engaging with. And so when we look at the kind of manual, so like how this programme is delivered in practice, there's 5 phases that functional family therapy will follow. So firstly, this is about engaging with the child and their family and really building trusting relationships and building the credibility of the programme. So recognising that we've got children that are displaying these behavioural difficulties, often in really challenging contexts. We've got families that might be interacting with multiple different services. They might not be, in the first phase, willing to engage with this programme. There might be some resistance to be involved. And so that first phase really is about building understanding and credibility for the programme and what the programme might be able to help that family to achieve. And so after that initial phase, this moves into really developing some strong confidence and relationship to get the programme moving. So this is about identifying what negative emotions or attitudes might be at play around what the potential for change is for that child and for their family. And so this is about really improving motivation to engage with the programme, to address feelings that might interact with or get in the way of the programme. So things like feelings of hopelessness, feelings of not being able to change the context or the challenges that the child or the family is facing, things like addressing blame that might take place between family members. And these are the types of things that could really interact with or reduce engagement with the programme that would affect how effective it can be. So the second phase, really important for getting everybody together and on board and developing that sense of hope of what this programme can achieve. So once they're at that stage, they then go into a process of assessment delivered both by the therapist and by the family in thinking about what are the strengths of the family dynamic, of family communication styles, the way that the family is supporting and working together, but then also what are the problems, what are the challenges, what are the areas of family dynamics and family relationships that this programme can address, to really help to address those behavioural difficulties and challenges that those children are facing. So once that kind of map is made of what those strengths and problems and challenges might be, the FFT program, the trainers are then able to really design something that's bespoke, specific to the needs and the strengths and the challenges of that family and that child. So this might involve putting together specific support packages, aligning delivery to support the specifics that have been addressed through that assessment process. So it might be things around social and emotional learning, it might be around communication styles, problem-solving approaches, conflict management, anger management. So a suite of different support products and processes will be put in place to address those specific needs. And these will often include like teaching specific skills and then really practicing those skills. And so once that quite intensive phase is delivered, we move into phase 5, the final stage of the programme, which is about helping that child and that family to practice those skills outside of the programme. So for example, where there's been a focus on developing conflict resolution approaches, strategies to communicating, ways of communicating with people that work in local authorities or services where they might be having really challenging conversations. This part of the programme is about making sure that the child and the family can use those skills in those other contexts. So how is it that we can make sure that the progress of this programme will continue longer term? And so this will be the child and the family communicating with individuals and professionals across education, across children's services, interactions with the police and with youth justice, and really seeing that progress come to life in those situations and interactions with services moving forward. So that's like a really high level overview. You'll get a little bit more of this when Raphael presents shortly. But this was the basis for our review of evidence for our toolkit. So I'll give you a very brief introduction to the toolkit if you haven't come across it before. But if you want to go and have a look either during the session or after, if you type YF toolkit into any search engine, you will find it. The main purpose of the toolkit is about looking at what the global evidence base is for various approaches to violence prevention, and then summarising that evidence into what should be a really easy read, really accessible product that helps you to quickly know what are the takeaway messages from the research evidence that we have available, and to give you some really actionable insights. What can I go away and do as a result of knowing this information? So the toolkit summarises that best available evidence on violence prevention approaches, and we want you to use that toolkit alongside your professional judgment. So the toolkit is summarising that evidence of evaluations of violence prevention approaches that have been delivered to children, young people, families in lots of different contexts, in different spaces, different times. And so we can learn from that. It can give us an idea about what best bets might be for violence prevention. But we want you to hold that alongside what you know from your consultations with children, with young people, with families, your strategic needs assessments, your understanding about what your violence problem profile or violence problem issues might be in your local areas. So when you go onto the toolkit, what you see is a very high-level summary card for each approach to violence prevention. And so today we're focusing on functional family therapy. And so this really high-level summary card gives you 3 key pieces of information. So when we've scanned the globe for the evidence that we have on the effectiveness of functional family therapy for violence and crime prevention for children and young people, we see that on average, FFT has a moderate impact on reducing violence. And so underneath that, what we see from those evaluations is that when you look across the studies available, FFT has reduced violence by 12%. We have seen across those studies improvements in family functioning, family relationships, and problem-solving skills in families. We've seen small impacts on behavioural difficulties in the sort of 6 to 12 month time frame. We see larger impacts on behavioural difficulties later, after sort of 18 to 24 months. When we've looked at internalising behaviours, so things like anxiety, depression, self-esteem, social withdrawal, on average, our studies are showing us that we see no effect, no change in these specific behaviours. And then when we've looked at out-of-home placement, so this is children and young people being placed in foster care, kinship care, residential, or into secure units, into the secure estate, we see mixed results. So we had a couple of studies showing reductions in out-of-home placements, a couple of studies showing no effect. It's quite hard to put these averages together. And essentially, what we want you to do with these overall findings and thinking about this overall average impact rating of moderate is to really think about what the evidence quality is alongside this. So the middle piece of information in this summary card here is our evidence quality rating. And so this is giving you essentially a score out of 5, so displayed to you in magnifying glasses. A score of 2 out of 5 is YEF saying to you, we've got a low level of confidence in that impact rating. And that's because we've got quite a weak evidence base on functional family therapy. So the main thing here is that we've got a very small number of studies that have looked at violence and crime. In terms of our impact rating, we only found 6 studies that had measures of reoffending that we could use to inform that estimate for the impact on violence. Most of those studies conducted in the US and one in the UK. And we see really varied effects. So follow-ups with children, young people, families were undertaken between 6 and 24 months. That moderate impact rating, that 12% reduction in violence, was the 6 to 12 month follow-up measure. When we looked at impacts at the sort of 15 to 18 month time frame, we saw that drop to on average a 4% reduction. And then when we looked at the average impact at 24 months, we saw it come back up to 12%. So we see a bit of variation. And something else that we consider in terms of giving that evidence quality rating is how much the results vary between those studies. And so another reason that we describe this as relatively weak evidence base is that those studies tell us quite different things. So we saw 3 studies showing positive effects on reducing reoffending, a couple of studies showing no effect, and 1 study showing a harmful effect. And so it's really, I think, a great benefit of the toolkit to give you this average. So you can see, okay, but if I put all of this information together, what's my takeaway message? So we're saying to you, on average, moderate impact on violence prevention, but just hold that thought on the evidence quality rating. And obviously, we're getting into a session after this to look at one of the studies that YF has funded to contribute to that evidence base and build up our UK evidence. And then finally, in terms of what we look at in our toolkit evidence is our cost rating. So this is just to give you a high level indication of typical costs of various approaches to violence prevention. And so for functional family therapy, we see this typically does come with a high cost. These programs are delivered by trained professionals and it's quite intensive delivery. And so when we're looking at UK delivery, we see this typically costs over £3,000 per family. So all of this evidence comes from studies that have looked at the impact of FFT specifically on violence and crime. We do have more studies that have looked at other outcomes and looked at how FFT has been implemented. So we've learned a little bit about how best we can implement FFT to maximise those positive impacts. And so we had 20 studies that informed this section of the toolkit summary. And if you click on it, you'll get a bit more information. But just to give you 3 really high-level points that came through across those evaluations of FFT. So firstly, came through really strongly in the evaluations and I think does across lots of different therapeutic interventions. But FFT really engages children and family members well when there's a really strong relationship between that therapist and the family. And that was really driven by having a really collaborative and open relationship. As mentioned earlier, the sort of out of out of hours support and being able to have a direct relationship with the therapist was seen as really important in some of those evaluations. The FFT programs where they're able to ensure that it's one therapist that works with that family through the whole program, that's where we tend to see better engagement, better feedback from children and families. And then the main sort of learning around FFT implementation does seem to be around how it is that we balance FFT alongside the multiple other services that are often being delivered to children and young people and their families for children that are already involved in violence, antisocial behaviour and crime. They will be interacting with other systems and services and support offers across education, across youth justice and policing, in their interactions with the voluntary and community sector and with local authorities and children's services. So there's quite a big job to do to make sure that all of the stakeholders that are engaging with that child and their family are aware of what's being provided and delivered through FFT. Some additional systems and processes might need to be put in place to make sure that communication with the child and the family is clear, that they're not being overwhelmed by interactions with various services and not getting things like clashes in appointments, making it really difficult for that family and child to commit to the programme and to make sure that they meet the requirements of the other services that they're engaging with. So part of managing that sort of multiple service demands on the family requires really good information sharing and communication between those services that are engaging with the child and the family. And so some of that is about putting in place new information sharing protocols and processes. Some of it is about making sure that there's really rigorous monitoring processes in place to identify how programs and support can be sequenced to maximise engagement from children and their families, and also to make sure that those services aren't overlapping and particularly really critical points for the family where they might have complex needs and complex situations that they're dealing with. So that's just a really high level overview of the evidence base, which is all summarised in our toolkit. And so at this point, I will just hop up one quick slide just to say, I've mentioned the toolkit a few times. We've looked at lots of other approaches to violence prevention beyond functional family therapy. This slide is just to give you a really quick overview that we've got 39 approaches in there. Go and have a look at the toolkit if you're interested in learning about other types of therapies or other approaches to violence prevention. And do drop me a line if you've got any questions or if you'd like to have a follow-up discussion about how we put toolkit evidence together and what we know about FFT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was great. Any questions from anyone in the audience? We've got a couple of comments in the chat, Laura, that you might want to look at. Tom Jefford has, this is really interesting. So FFT is currently being used in highly successful social outcomes partnerships in the UK, avoiding over 500,000 care days across Norfolk and Suffolk. This evidence is in the grey market rather than research trial evidence. Yeah, I don't know if you knew about those outcome partnerships, Laura.
Yes, yeah. So some of those evaluations may not feature in our evidence base where we're focused on studies that are capturing violence and crime outcomes, but I will go and have a look at those and see if we can add references to those in our toolkit summary.
Excellent. And then Sajid has also, I don't know if you can read that, Laura, has put a comment in as well about toolkit criterion grading can vary. So in the foundations toolkit, FFT has 3+ out of 4, although it's based on an old assessment from the early intervention foundation days.
Yeah, so yeah, we do have different approaches to how we sort of rate our evidence, and so foundations are looking very specifically at some specific studies, and they've used that evidence to put this guidance together on how you can implement it to achieve maximum impact, and they are very focused on the UK evidence base. We in the toolkit have this much broader look at the global evidence base. And so we will rate the evidence slightly differently, focused on what we can learn from it in terms of violence and crime outcomes specifically.
Thanks, Laura. And then we've got a couple of questions. One from Rowan Luke. How does FFT compare to systemic therapy outcomes? And one from Tasnia. Is FFT a part of systemic family therapy?
Yeah, so if I just give a brief answer to that, and then I think it might be covered in one of the later presentations. But yeah, so we have a review of evidence on multi-systemic therapy in our toolkit as well. And so that also shows on average a moderate impact on violence and crime prevention. It's another one where there are several evaluations, but evidence from the UK is mixed. And so there's a real space for us here, I think, on both approaches to develop the UK evidence base. And both types of therapy they need to be applied specifically to the needs of the children and families that we're working with. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Gail.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. We're now going to move on to Raphael's presentation. Raphael, Yanina's managed to open the slides, which is great. So she will open them now and then share and just give her instructions when you want things to move on. Over to you, Yanina.
Hey, thank you very much. It's really good to be here today. My name's Raphael Cadenhead. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the programme manager of functional family therapy in London, covering 3 London boroughs, and I work for Family Psychology Mutual. So I am just waiting for the lovely slides to load in the background. Yeah, so my background is actually in social work and systemic psychotherapy. So it's really interesting to see those questions in the chat about systemic psychotherapy, which I think Laura is addressing not so much MST, but I think more generic systemic psychotherapy, which I was also trained in. And perhaps I can give a bit of a contextualization of the differences between the two and how FFT sort of works in practice, as well as the implementation. So we move across some of these slides. I think there's one that shows my face, just in case. It's a younger picture of me. Unfortunately, I've got many more grey hair since the beginning of this trial, so I often feel that doesn't relate to how I look now, but that was me a few years ago. And then the next slide will show some of the things I'm hoping to cover in my time slot. So firstly, I want to give a bit of an overview of the functional family therapy programme in London, which is specifically working with children who are facing exploitation risks in the community or extrafamilial harm. Then I'm going to be looking at some of our implementation and programme management requirements that's made it possible to implement FFT within the context we're working in. Give a bit of an overview of some of the data systems that we're using for oversight and monitoring, which in my experience have been really key to making sure that this has been a sort of successful project. And then we're going to speak through some of the referral pathways and what it takes to identify eligible children and families. And finally, summarising some key messages around effective FFT delivery and implementation. So if I zoom in firstly on the FFT programme overview, so I think that will be the next slide and the next one after this. So hopefully the next one will emerge. Yes, so just to set the context for you all. So we're implementing FFT within a particular context of extrafamilial harm across 3 London boroughs. So those boroughs are Haringey, Tower Hamlets and Redbridge. We also have experience as a mutual, as a social enterprise, of setting up FFT teams in other settings. So we have a Pan-London project where we worked across 10 local authorities, and we have currently active FFT projects in both Suffolk and Norfolk. Sorry, just to go back to that previous slide. I feel like we're back in COVID days where I'm having to navigate slides. But yeah, so this funded project was set up within the context of an efficacy randomized controlled trial. And just a signal now, and then I'll come back to it a bit later, some of the additional adjustments required to ensure various, I suppose, tasks and actions could be carried out in an effective way. Firstly, it was thinking about how to enable referrers and families to sort of accept the idea of an RCT where there would be randomization and what it might take to have achieved that. Secondly, it's getting sufficient numbers of referrals and consultations to reach the project target of 288 randomizations. Thirdly, it's a real-time data oversight of the research process, which, as I was saying earlier, has been really key to making sure that we can identify and problem solve any barriers or issues. And then fourthly, it's that real coordination and collaboration with the research team who will be presenting after me to address barriers and challenges as the project has progressed. So that's the sort of context that we're working in. And if we move on to the next slide, I can discuss in more detail, why on earth bother with a family-based approach in the first place. As someone who worked in social services and was a social worker and then trained in systemic family therapy, something I've been really mindful of is how often a lot of the interventions with children at risk of exploitation or contextual risks, the approach services often take are quite individually focused. So often you'll find sort of mentoring program for a child, and then separately to that, there may be a parenting program for the parents or caregivers. What I find really exciting and special about functional family therapy is the emphasis on working with the family as a whole, all the major players in the family who have some influence over the child's life, maybe struggling to have influence, but have some level of influence, and how the model is encouraging the therapist to work with those family relationships to improve them, so that the family functions almost like a protective unit and a safer base for children. And the idea there is that by doing that, you help them, the child and the family together, deal with risks outside the family home more effectively in collaboration with other services. So we know that an efficacy randomized control trial was undertaken in the USA, Philadelphia, in relation to FFTG or FFT gangs. And in that particular trial, young people were referred to the trial by a family court judge on the basis of gang risk, and that consisted of current or prior gang activity, or having a family member or close friend in a gang. Now, the study found that FFTG was more effective than treatment as usual at reducing reoffending rates for that cohort during the 12 months following the end of the intervention. But I suppose the YEF were interested in looking at this FFT sort of accommodation in a UK context and sort of being really mindful of the racialization of children and adultification. We felt it was really important to change the language of gangs to extrafamilial harm and recognize the status of children as being victims to forms of exploitation. So if I go on to the next slide, I can explain a bit more what that might look like. So FFT-EFH, I think, is the language we landed on. So FFT for extra familial harm is very similar to what you could characterize as FFT standard in the way that sort of Laura described the sort of process of the therapy. So it's very similar in its structure and approach. But what I would say is that this particular accommodation of FFT has a shift of emphasis and focus in the assessment of risk and protective factors as they relate to those extrafamilial risks in the outside the family home. And there's also a greater emphasis in the sort of outreach within the local community to ensure that therapists have sufficient credibility with families. So just to speak through what that might look like in practice. So first, I think clinical skills are used to address common dilemmas related to the risks of repercussion, for example, or reprisal, if young people and families share information. I mean, this is a really key dilemma. Often families and children are under enormous sense of threat from people exploiting children not to share information, and if they do, there will be a consequence. So having a therapist come in a traditional systemic family therapy way, asking questions may be really threatening. So there's some really smart skills FFT uses to try and address and name some of those really complex dilemmas. A second point to really note is that sort of integration and participation with other services to ensure that it's a really coordinated and joined up approach in terms of the intervention being offered. And what's quite intriguing in some ways is how some of the dilemmas children may face in the community might be rehearsed with family members and children in sessions to help them develop skills to manage some of these risks in the community. And we also recognise that lots of these children have faced multiple layers of trauma in the community. having observed or being victimized by or perpetrating violence. And so the interventions used to sort of address that are really tailored to ensure we're addressing the concerns around violence and trauma. So the next slide will hopefully show you a bit more overview of that. So this is another way of representing the phases of the FFT model. And just in brief, for those that sort of may be really interested in this and maybe implementing it within their own local authorities, there is this engagement phase where we're really trying to get families in the room together, often families who are highly traumatized, where children are being exploited. There's high levels of blame, and sometimes simply getting them in the room together, in the same space together, can be really challenging. So in engagement, the therapist is really working to align with each member of the family and trying to bring them all together. Then in that motivation phase, we're exploring ways in which we can reduce negativity and blame, increase hope, and create a different understanding of the risks. So moving it from a position of blaming one individual, often the child will blame the caregiver and the caregiver will blame the child. How do we make that understanding of what's going on much more relational? And the aim of that is so that everyone comes away from that phase thinking that they have a part to play in making a difference. And then when we transition into what you can see here in the top right, that sort of behavior change, is we're really upskilling families and children with all sorts of skills that could be emotional regulation, communication, problem solving, impulse control, all sorts of skills together that will help offset the risks in the community. And then we're generalizing those skills into other contexts. So it might be the child's relationship with a school teacher or with peers, or it might be the parent's relationship with the school, for example. So how do you apply those skills in new contexts that help reduce risks? And also sort of help with that relapse prevention and sustainability planning. So I'm going to move quite briefly to speak about the implementation of FFT, which I think is the next few slides. So hopefully if we can move on to the next one. Yeah, the eligibility criteria very briefly is children between 10 to 17 where there are concerns about extrafamilial harm. And we need to have an allocated caseload, and the child needs to be at home 50% or more of the time so that we can actually do some of that family-based work. The next slide will show ineligibility criteria, and I'll just very quickly show you that before I then speak about the implementation opportunities and strategies. So we go on to the next slide from here. Unfortunately, that's not me. It looks a bit like me putting those post-it notes up, but unfortunately that isn't. Okay, so on to the next slide. So obviously implementation is really important. It's all very well having an evidence-based model, but how do you actually make that work in the context of children's social care? And there's all sorts of additional work that's needed to integrate FFT within local systems, induct and train staff, and ensure sufficient risk management. One of the first things we experience is the absolute critical importance of a mobilisation period to ensure that this groundwork is put in place before we start delivering therapy. And that includes not just staff induction, but also process development before the intervention starts. What we also experienced is the importance of repeating and revisiting expectations and operational principles throughout the project to ensure that there's real retention and effective implementation at all points. And you can imagine setting up 3 teams and 3 different local authorities can bring all sorts of complexity. And we have found it really key to have sort of monthly steering group meetings with senior management within that local authority where there is buy-in and investment to problem solve together on any sort of shared challenges about getting FFT off the ground and any challenges with referral processes, say. Another thing which really shocked me, I never thought I'd be really into data in a big way, but I've come to really appreciate over the last few years the incredible value of having data systems that are efficient, that ensure oversight and monitoring, both for the supervisors in each of the 3 boroughs, but also for me as programme manager. And it's not done with I suppose, spirit of surveillance. It's much more about how do we spot issues and troubleshoot really effectively to ensure there are no delays and issues. And that real-time access to what's going on is absolutely key to that. I realise that relying on self-reporting can often mean that things are brought a bit later and you don't have that sort of speed with which to intervene when there are issues or delays, say, in the progress of therapy or in referral and consultation rates. Just to move on to the next slide. Yes, I suppose the thing to stress here is just the variety of meetings that are so important to have at different levels of context to make sure that problems can be troubleshooted and addressed. So we have sort of weekly case management meetings in each borough with the supervisor and business support officer. And that's where we talk through referral and consultation rates, any staffing issues, allocations, delays, that sort of stuff. We have a supervisors meeting, which is a sort of bringing all the supervisors together with the central management team to think through clinical dilemmas, project issues, and ensuring consistency across the 3 boroughs. There's obviously individual supervision I would have with each supervisor. We have a sort of core management meeting where higher level sorts of management and project issues are discussed. We have meetings with the research team as well to ensure that any recruitment issues or referral issues are being addressed. And to ensure monitoring of safeguarding and risk issues, there's a weekly meeting that supervisors will have with their team to ensure that's being sort of addressed appropriately. So lots of different meetings that are necessary to ensure that level of oversight can be sort of secured in the project. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, these beloved data systems. So if we go on to the next one after this, I was trying to find pictures that really matched the subject matter. So, just to name that real-time case tracking, we actually developed a system for that that highlights delays, bottlenecks, highlighting visibility around the phase that each child is in. And it's trying to do that in a very collaborative spirit to improve outcomes for children and families. Now, I think on the next slide, you get to see an overview of what that might look like on one of the systems. So obviously blotted out names here of therapists, but you can see here how there's close oversight of the session pacing, the time it's taking to get from one session to another, the duration of the therapy, what phase they're in. And that, again, allows immediate visibility over any delays. And we know that with families facing these risks, taking a long time to get in is disastrous. We want to be really efficient, quick. We want to show families that we're there for them. And sort of having this oversight really improves that responsiveness. To the next slide. Referral pathways also really key. I think that's so important in the mobilisation period, and it has required lots of conversations continually throughout the project. So the next slide will show a little bit what we've had to do to secure this. One thing I remember from my social work days, I don't know how many social workers or social work managers are here. We get fed up so much with bureaucracy and having to fill out thousands of forms that take hours and hours. So we agreed from the very beginning that consultations will be a conversation with the caseholder, and the supervisor or BSO will write the consultation form up and share it with the caseholder afterwards. We find that having another referral form just increases bureaucracy and can become a barrier to accessing services. So we try to streamline that. Another really important thing about referrals, you'd think that with a service that is being funded by the Youth Endowment Fund, that you get thousands and thousands of referrals and that you wouldn't need to do very much work to identify those suitable families and children. But what we've come to realise is not to rely on caseholders to come forward, and you do need a really proactive, assertive outreach. So we have asked for data systems within local authorities to screen families, reach out to caseholders. We have monthly meetings or fortnightly meetings with service heads to go through cases on their caseholders' caseloads. So multiple ways of accessing and offering this service to families. And I think also what we find is there are challenges to formulating what the problem is, and not everyone has a sort of systemic understanding of what the challenge of the extrafamilial harm might look like. So you'll often hear referrers saying, yeah, the children don't want to speak to their parents and vice versa, but it might be that's what is needed. And so it does require sometimes a bit of a systemic formulation to see the value of family-based work. I'm mindful I might be running out of time, so I want to whiz through the next few slides just so that I give time for the University of Greenwich to offer their reflections too. But just to summarise some of those key takeaways. So firstly, the importance of mobilisation. A really well-planned mobilisation phase has been so key to setting up the foundation for the systems, the processes and the procedures before launching the service. Having data systems that really work clinically and for program management, like it's not collecting data for the sake of it, it's ensuring that the service we're offering is as clinically robust as it can be. And so it's data serving clinical practice. Thirdly, it's multiple meetings at different levels of context to ensure collaboration. And I think often when there has been a problem, it's because we're not meeting the right people or we're not having access to those sort of collaborative conversations. And then fourthly, and I think this is such a learning for me as a person, I think I assume that you say something maybe once or twice and then that idea takes on life of its own. But I think in reality, you often have to repeat and revisit parameters and expectations, because that information is very quickly lost. I think people's lives are busy and there are competing demands. So I think there is something about the importance of that sort of spiral learning where you are repeating and revisiting similar principles in different contexts. As I transition, the next slide I think is like a nice segue, hopefully, for the University of Greenwich's offerings. But obviously, just to really name that enabling an RCT to run within a social care context has added complexity, and just to sort of share two reflections based on engaging the workforce at our end as a provider and also engaging families. I just thought I would just speak very briefly on that before Helen and Sajid take over from the research side of things. So firstly, with the workforce, it's quite difficult for I think for lots of practitioners to explain what an RCT is, what a trial is, and the complexities of that. And so we recognised quite early on, firstly, to offer some scripts about how you might introduce FFT and the idea of research, but also in some ways taking away that responsibility of explaining everything to families. So a key role we have is the trial facilitator. So the case holder will ask the family, are you happy for a sort of colleague of mine to speak and talk to you a little bit more about this sort of service and a trial? And as soon as we've got that permission, the trial facilitator will have a conversation. And it's for her really to explain the research design and FFT to families so that they're well informed before giving consent to meet the research team. So for us, what we found is it's really putting the onus on the trial facilitator as opposed to the case holder to ensure that that explanation is given to families. I think the other thing in terms of engaging families is emphasising at every turn that it's entirely their choice. They can drop out at any point. They don't have to progress on to the next stage. It's completely up to them. And it's to avoid that sense of pressure. And we find that most families are very happy to progress on to the next stage. They very rarely decline, and this so far in the project, they're rarely declining the study because of randomization. It's often because of other competing demands that they decline. So it's quite interesting, really, from my point of view. I think that's the end of my offering. Hopefully that's a nice summary of our work, the work around implementation, and also what we've had to do to sort of accommodate the efficacy randomized controlled trial. So hopefully now Sajid and Helen can now move on to their offering for the day.
Thank you so much, Raphael. That was fascinating. And I've written down a load of questions that I've got, but I won't hog the room later on. I imagine lots of people have got questions as well. We are going to move straight on to Sajid and Helen to talk about the evaluation, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end to include Raphael as well as Sajid and Helen. So yeah, over to you, Tim.
Okay, just checking you can all see that okay? Great. So I guess what we're going to talk about is our journey evaluating this intervention within this particular context. So I appreciate most people are here to learn about the evaluation, sorry, the therapy. And so I will be upfront and say this is not going to be the highlight of today's session, but I think it's also important to understand the process of actually going through attempting to evaluate this sort of intervention with the problem we're trying to tackle and the setting we're trying to tackle. And I guess that's the first thing to flag, is that whilst we're talking about familial harm, when we started this process, which was way back in 2019, our focus was a bit more zoned in on county lines. And I won't talk through what this means. I'm sure most of you are well aware of it, but just to summarise, This is a business model where drugs are transported out of urban hubs to new rural markets, typically by organised criminal groups. And the key thing that we're interested in terms of this issue is the exploitation of vulnerable children and young people in that model. And that's our focus in terms, and that has been our focus in terms of trying to tackle this problem. And so back then, there were really very, very little in the way of any intervention attempts to try and understand how to stop this happening, whether it was specifically the Cadenhead drug business model or actually CT more broadly. And so we settled on using FFT as a potential model. I won't go through the rationale too much because Raphael mainly covered it, primarily because of the tentative evidence from the Philadelphia study showing that it had an effect on reducing gang involvement. And so in terms of looking for some kind of evidence-based model that actually tackled extrafamilial harm, it looked like a good shout. I guess the important thing to note that what we were doing in the first instance was just to assess whether this was viable at all, both in terms of actually implementing it within children's social care as an intervention, but also from our perspective, especially whether it's viable to actually evaluate it. And there are good reasons for having serious doubts about that, because despite the efforts of what works for children's social care and now foundations, the evidence base for randomized controlled trials, at least in UK children's social care, is very, very poor, has been very, very poor, and certainly at this point was littered with failures. Lots of trials attempted, well, a handful of trials attempted, and almost all of them failed horribly, primarily because researchers couldn't get social workers to refer cases. So we were really interested in actually assessing whether we could get this off the ground at all. And so the aim was essentially a two-stage initial pilot study, the first stage being a feasibility study, whereby we would roll out intervention in children's social care in one particular local authority, and then assess whether social workers would be interested and put up with a randomized design. And we went in very open to the possibility that they would say, no, we will not put up with this. We'd have to think about a different way of evaluating it. But also really importantly, we went in without any really, really clear idea of how we'd actually identify young people who would benefit from the intervention, because certainly at the time, this has shifted a bit since then. The systems in MASH and other social care assessment teams to identify CC really poor. It was very, very hard to get clear flags to pick these things up. And that's a broader history around children's social care having typically been focused in on harms within the family rather than extrafamilial harm. And we also wanted to do a basic test of the delivery and the intervention. Following the results of this, we felt, which I'll talk to in a second, we felt comfortable that we should move towards a randomized pilot study, which is what we did after that. We found that we could run it in children's social care. We found good referral rates and good recruitment rates of families and young people, managed to hold on to those families and young people. And the aim here was to basically establish the kind of parameters we'd need to run a bigger trial, which is what we're doing right now. And we detected some signal of effect. Note that this is a really small study, only 45 families. So all of this has to be taken with a large sack of salt. The other issue here, which some of you might pick up from the left-hand graph here, which is showing changes in family functioning, is families weren't the same at the start of the study. So in essence, randomization just didn't work here. And that can happen when you've got a very, very small sample. Just by sheer chance, we had quite a lot of early help cases going into the FFT arm, and they turned out to have less severe problems. The other thing to keep note here is this study was conducted during COVID, which made it very, very challenging. And we did manage to get the thing done, no small part of Raphael's efforts, but that had an impact on our ability to actually get enough evidence to assess the viability of the study. I think probably more importantly than the findings of the pilot trial were the findings of the feasibility stage. And that's because of some of the reasons I said in terms of social care RCTs being problematic, but also in terms of some of the findings from FFT in the UK, which I've had something to do with, and other evidence-based interventions imported from the US, like MSD, which had quite mixed results in UK trials. So it's important to assess whether we could actually run this effectively in the UK. And the other issue we had, which was quite a significant problem, was in the pilot, and currently our primary outcome we're looking to shift isn't actually CCE, because the YES focuses on offending. And so we were assessing self-reported offending, and that did not do well as an outcome in the pilot. Young people were telling us they had never done anything other than dodge the fare on the bus, but their social care records were demonstrating something very, very, very different. So there really wasn't very much honest reporting on this measure, and that's a major challenge when you're trying to assess the effect of an intervention on the main thing you're meant to be measuring. That partly because it was really hard to get a reliable measure of CCE from the admin data. And the other issue we had was we were trying to assess, as I said, who would best benefit from this and how to identify them, crucially, from the information we had. What we found from the feasibility study, which was primarily about interviewing social workers, about 20 people or so, was there was what I would call a grudging acceptance of a randomized evaluation. And that was primarily because of the desire for the intervention to continue in the setting. There was a really, really big difference in attitudes between social workers who had referred and had something to do with the FFT team and those who had not. Those who had were really quite okay with an RCT. Those who hadn't had much to do with FFT really weren't very keen on the idea at all. And part of the reason we set up the efficacy trial in the way that Raphael has described is some of those responses we got. And so we found it was really important for the FPM team to be really heavily involved in the recruitment process and having a lot of the interface with referring social workers, which is, not classic clinical trials design. You traditionally, people have wanted a real separation between research teams and delivery teams. My view is that's naive and doesn't actually work very well in practice, particularly in these sorts of settings. The other issue is we got really, really mixed responses from social workers in terms of how to identify eligible cases, and a very, very mixed response in who would best benefit from the intervention. So some people were saying, this is preventative, you need to go in early before things have gone too far, because once their children are really involved in these networks, it's too late. Whereas others were saying, this is targeted and needs to zone in on those who are most involved to extract them before things are too late. So we used a broad set of criteria that you've already seen from the Child Safeguarding Practice Review report from 2020, supplemented with consultations in order to actually identify eligibility effectively. And then what we did to try and capture CCE was add in some additional questions to our self-reporting delinquency measure to ask if they had been involved in criminal behaviour, whether somebody had been involved in it. And then what we've done is attempt to set up our assessment system so that the data on offending and CC are entirely separate from all the other questionnaire data, such that we can't see any of that data until the trial ends. In other words, we can't breach anonymity and make disclosures because we don't have access to it. And we're hopeful that that will increase honest responding in terms of the delinquency measure and the CCE measure. We won't know until 2028. I think at this point I'm handing over to Helen.
Thanks. Yeah, so to kind of add on to what Raphael was mentioning around sort of our data systems for how we currently run the RCT. I appreciate this is probably a little bit of an overwhelming chart to look at for the first time, but it speaks to the invaluable sort of data reporting that we have behind tracking where things are happening. So if you look, I can give a little bit of a brief intro to what this shows. That line graph in the top right hand corner is our randomizations each month. So we've been able to kind of analyze live as we go how many we're getting each month. So you can see this, we've had dips at certain points, and we've been able to kind of problem solve as we've been going. And that chart at the bottom shows where different cases are at in the system, and we can see from the average days in each section, we can see where things take like delays are happening, and we can problem solve as we go within this RCT. And as Sajid was saying, the collaboration between the delivery partners and us in the evaluation team has been really key. So this system is a live tracker that's based on Microsoft List and Power BI for those interested in the tech side of it. But it links in with various different views for the delivery team and for us. So there's different permissions. So obviously there's still the level of independent research for us as evaluators, but it all links together and really helps us practically take forward and investigate as we're going on. If we go on to the next slide, I'll speak to some of the other outputs that we get from the system that help us in our evaluation. So this speaks to the consultation phase. So this is the phase at which point referrers either provide cases that they want to put into the trial, or the Family Psychology Mutual will have looked at case records to extract families they think might be suitable. So you can see in that the table in the middle, you've got 62% have come from referrers directly, and about 30 or 29% have come from data reports. And there's various other meetings as well that have below that that show where the referrals for our cases come from, which is a really interesting thing for us to review as we go, to see what other doors we could kind of push open or kind of explore to get as many referrals as possible. And like Raphael was saying, kind of being in the speaking to the right people in the boroughs has been massively important, and this data behind it has really helped us explore that. You can also see some of the breakdown in sort of the demographics of the families that we speak to at this stage. Again, this has been really important for us to look at so that we know how best to engage with these families throughout the research process. You can see on the right-hand side, we've had a lot of Bangladesh families. That's primarily from Tower Hamlets, but that's been really helpful for us to know sort of upfront so we can prepare and engage in the best way. Things like acknowledging if they're from Muslim families when Ramadan's happening, like now, it's really helpful for us to know that in sort of our engagement. So this data has been really helpful. If we click onto the next one, it just shows the consultation chart. So again, this is similar to the chart before. We've been able to look at where consultations are happening, so breaking down that phase even further. I won't go into this too much, but just kind of give all of the data that we look at in a lot of detail really helps us out. If we go on to the next slide, just have this shows some of the demographics of the families that get randomized. So this is after that consultation phase. We can see that a lot of the families are no one is disadvantaged after this stage. So the same patterns are shown in the demographics here as they are at consultation phase. So no specific type of family is excluded because it's a research trial, but that is important for us to test that. So that kind of shows that here. We'll move on to the next one. This shows the dropout reasons. So we kind of spoke about it, and Raphael spoke to it earlier, that the reason that families drop out of the research process is predominantly for other reasons rather than it being specifically because it's a research trial. So if I kind of explain some of the wording here, so declined and withdrawn and become ineligible are all slightly different, or mean slightly different things. And the list on the left hand side there, you can see what the major reason for people dropping out is. So you can see that the top two reasons are because the caregiver or the young person doesn't think they want therapy. So it's not because it's a research trial, they're not put off by the 50-50 predominantly, it's because it's just not the right time for them to have therapy. They don't want it at this stage. So, but it's really important for us to know that and kind of mitigate those things as best we can. That kind of speaks to the next bit that we wanted to touch base on, was on the next slide. We're doing a bit of extra work on top of the kind of main evaluation, and we want to look at how RCTs are implemented. So there's two different levels of implementation. How do you implement FFT, and then how do you actually implement this sort of evaluation, this trial structure into social care? And this is, as Sajid was saying, there's been a lot of challenges in trials in this area. And this is actually an example of a really successful implementation of a trial. We've actually got really good referrals from it, where we'll be reaching our target of families recruited, which is a massive feat. And we want to be able to investigate that and share that learning for future trials in this area. So what we're doing is we're looking at these three questions. We're looking at the experience of RCTs implemented into social care, what the impact has been, and what are the reasons behind some of our missing data and dropout rates. If you just move on to the next slide, we'll just show you some of the methods we're doing to look into that. We've done a researcher workshop, so we've done a kind of a self-reflection amongst the fieldwork researchers, which is often missing in some of the evaluations in this sort of area, but it's a vital element of the learning taken from this trial. So we've done that. We've interviewed the delivery team, so the managers and the therapists. We've had interviews with them to kind of get their perspective on how this RCT is run. We've also been doing interviews with borough staff, so that's included referrers, people that have referred into the trial, but also those that haven't referred into the trial, and exploring the reasons behind why they might not have referred in, and some of their managers as well. We've also interviewed some of the families, so those families that have been part of the trial, and that's included parents and young people. Also acknowledging that we want to understand why families drop out. So we can't interview those families because they've dropped out and withdrawn their permission. But what we still have is that analysis of our tracker system. So we've kept track as we've gone of the reasons people have dropped out, as you saw in the earlier chart. So we're aiming to do some analysis on that to feed into this this bit of work. You can see on the right hand side we're creating this within the consolidated framework for implementation research, which is a really helpful structure to kind of highlight where things are happening at different levels. So you've got the individuals involved, you've got the inner setting, so the different boroughs, what impact that has. Then you've got the outer setting, looking at what the structure of social care, what impacts that, and then looking at the process of things, how things are organised, how things are communicated as well. So that's a really helpful thing for us to helpful structure for us to work on. If we just move on to the final slide that I've got on this implementation research, this is just, again, probably a bit intimidating to look at to start with. There's a lot of words, but this is a mind map that we created from. This is just from the researchers. So this is just from our workshop, our conversation amongst fieldwork researchers around the things that we found have impacted implementing this RCT. So things like the RCT would be really helpful in the future to really co-design it with participants and stakeholders from a really early onset to make sure that it really fits in with their needs. Things in terms of the outer setting and really understanding the social care workload pressures has been invaluable to us. Things like engaging with the referrers throughout the process, like keeping them updated, having that sort of connection throughout the process has been really invaluable to keep referrers referring as well, making sure that they're involved in the process. It's not just that they're blindly throwing a family at a invisible evaluation, they don't know who we are, really engaging with them, and obviously treading that line between independence but collaboration at the same time. Then also kind of looking into the individuals involved. There's varying difference of opinions around RCTs is really important for us to manage how that's communicated through to referrers, and some of the more process driven things like having the tracker systems or having the right templates for communication is been really important. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of draw together the findings from the researchers, from the families, from the borough staff, and from delivery partners in FPM, and we're going to present sort of recommendations for research in this area moving forward, and kind of share some of our learning points that we've had from this really large research trial, RCT in social care. So hopefully we can share that and be helpful for research in the future. That is everything that I had to go through. I think we've got our contact details on the last slide. That's everything.
Thanks, Helen and Sajid. That was so interesting. And then just a quick follow-up, Helen, on your last point. Have you already got plans of what forums you're going to share that learning in?
So we want a journal article, and we're exploring where best to present that at the moment. But I was just talking with the team actually this morning about it, and we really want to kind of speak to the different target audiences, and that includes like families and young people, to include them in that full process. So we want to explore kind of having a really targeted output for each of those stakeholders. So that's the, I know that's not a solid, tangible answer, but we want to present to different audiences.
And there will be a YF report as well, Gail.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, we'll look forward to hearing more about it, and I'm sure people on the call would be really interested in that as well. I'm going to now open up for questions. Just to kick us off, Rowan Lucas put one in the chat, which I think is specifically for Sajid and Helen, because it came in during your presentation. So for some reason my chat has moved around a bit, so I'll just have to find it. Bear with me. How does the culture norm have a place in FFT?
Not certain that is for us. I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Raphael, does it speak to you, or maybe Rowan, you want to come in?
Just reading that question, I would probably assume, and unless say differently in the chat, that it's probably something around how do you accommodate to different sort of cultural, religious contexts and ensure the therapy is a sufficient match maybe for that particular context. So maybe I speak to that, but if that's not the question, put a stop in the chat or something so I know to. Brilliant, I got a confirmation. Yes, so I don't want to be too finicky technical, but there are just a couple of things maybe to name about sort of how we approach that. I think firstly, hopefully it's no surprise to anyone on the call that a lot of the families where there are extrafamilial harm or contextual risk will have faced multiple layers of like disadvantage and forms of marginalization, oppression in society from professionals. What we often find is that particularly caregivers, but also children, when we're being referred in, they often have like an ambivalent or hostile relationship with professionals based on prior experiences of being done to or being othered. So I think there's a particular skill, or I suppose you could describe as a skill that is like a golden thread throughout the intervention, which is called matching in FFT, which is really adapting the therapist's responses and behaviours to align to the sort of cultural, religious frame, you could describe it as, of the family, and ensuring use of language fits and is relevant. And that's all in the interest of becoming credible, but also I think validating and recognizing historic experiences of othering and oppression. I think also in the behavior change phase, which I discussed a bit earlier, a lot of work is done into tailoring the skills to ensure that they really fit with the family and with the beliefs and ideas of the family. So even though there's maybe skill development around communication or emotional regulation, we ensure we do that in a way that's going to be a fit. And also in that final phase, but again, it's something that runs throughout. It's, we don't want to, FFT is not an intervention that just comes in and disappears. Like, we want to make sure that when we leave, that the family links with the local community, and that might include maybe religious figures or resources in the community that are a really good fit for them that can sustain change in the long term. So we think really intentionally from the offset about how do we firstly build credibility in those communities, but also before we leave, how do we make sure that those relationships feel really nurtured to sustain change in the long term. So hopefully that gives a bit of an answer. There's more I could say about it, but yeah, just as sort of touch, like give a nod to some of those strategies, really.
Thanks, Raphael. And I wondered if, and thank you, Marie. I've spotted that you've put, you've told us about a case study on Strong Families Norfolk that has been used by the Go Lab at Oxford University. So thank you for sharing that. Raphael, while we've almost got you still on holding the mic, I wonder if you can go back to right at the beginning when you were saying you could talk more about the differences between FFT and other types of systemic therapy.
Yeah, so maybe these are very broad brushstrokes, I suppose, and I do lots of like teaching and lecturing on systemic psychotherapy and systemic practice for social workers. So like in some ways I avoid too much like a binary, like good or bad. Like I think generic systemic psychotherapy is really useful. I suppose in that more generic school of family therapy, there's often much more focus on asking questions, which would be, to use again like the technical language, like circular or reflexive, to explore like meaning making and narratives. I think within an FFT lens, particularly in that first phase motivation, there is a risk that asking lots of those questions with families who are really upset, traumatized, blaming, very negative, that the more questions you ask, the more negativity gets elicited. So there's some really smart FFT skills that are using principles of like reframing, which are in the sort of systemic world, but where you might be languaging that as a statement and joining each person's behavior together. Rather than asking lots of series of questions. You would still ask questions, but there is a way in which you can do that, which immediately sort of lowers that intense negativity and blame. So the other piece that can be a bit different, but has always been a part of systemic psychotherapy from the very beginning, is that sort of behavior change phase. Therapists take a bit more of an active, maybe almost you could describe like a bit teaching role, where once they've understood the patterns in the family, they might offer a skill and enable that to be practiced between family members. So it might be a particular way of communicating that isn't as blaming, but still conveys each other's emotions, say. So that might involve modeling, the therapist modeling what that skill is, then coaching families to use that skill, giving feedback on the use of the skill, thinking about how it can be applied in situations between sessions. So in that way, it becomes a little bit more active and maybe at times didactic. And I say the third element that's a bit different is the therapist's behaviours are sort of shaped by the goal you're in. So if you're in the beginning goals of motivation, you're really focusing on sort of 5 main goals around increasing hope, reducing negativity and blame, and relational focus and balanced alliance. So all your activities are really driven towards meeting those goals. As you move into the next phase, the goals shift. You can always go back to some of those skills that you've done in motivation, but your priority shifts a bit. And that is a little bit different from systemic psychotherapy. And that's probably the product of the sort of manualization in FFT, that there are certain phases you're following, and that does shape the sort of activity of the therapist. So again, hopefully, I know we can't hear back from you, which is a shame. It's me talking and can't hear a response, but yeah, hopefully that gives a little bit of an explanation of the difference.
Yeah, we can bring people in if people want to come back. Yeah, they just have to put their hand up, and then we have a very slight lag while Yanina unmutes them. But if the person who asked that question right back at the beginning, which was Tasnia, if you do want to come back in, just put your hand up, Tasnia, and we'd welcome the dialogue and discussion. Any other questions from the audience? I've got another question for Helen and Sajid that struck me, and I might have missed it, but I just wondered if but all our presenters talked about the value of data. both from a delivery and evaluation perspective in so many different ways. I just wondered, and I hope I've not missed it, whether there've been any challenges in data inputting, because I know from my own experience in delivering projects that was such a big challenge for frontline workers to input accurately.
Which source of data are you thinking about there, Gail? Outcome data or?
Outcome data and process data as well.
Yeah, I mean, Helen's probably best to speak to this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like process, so the sorts of data that I was showing there in terms of the staff tracking it, I think there's been minute issues with like data being like a date being wrong or something. But as Raphael was saying, we have such regular check-ins within FPM and then with us and within ourselves as well, that we catch those really quickly, I think, and we're able to tweak that. And because the systems talk to each other, so like on a technical side, like when referrers refer in, that goes on a system that only FPM can see, and then when they get permission to speak to the research team, that literally copies everything over to us. So it's not like we're not trying to copy and paste things over, it's a whole system copying it over. So it really mitigates the potential for incorrect data to be put into the next system, if that makes sense. So again, kind of linking in with all of the communication between all of us, and a really solid data system has really helped mitigate that. In terms of outcome measures, the answer is we don't know, because we haven't got to the analysis stage yet, and particularly for that, the primary outcome, we still can't see it to the end of the trial, because that was the whole idea, that it was confidential until the final analysis. So we don't know is the answer on that bit.
But we do have
Thank
some
you.
processes checking in, in terms of data completion, and although we can't see the outcome data, we have got somebody else, as it were, keeping an eye on it and making sure, you know, IDs are coming in and things are being filled in.
Yeah, so we know that they've like completed it, we just don't know how they've completed it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so
that's really helpful. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And Tom from Family Psychology Mutual has also added in the chat, it's fair to say that we've made significant investment in data systems, with a talented data analyst building this as a bespoke model to integrate systems. That's really helpful to know as well. Thank you, Tom. We've just got a few minutes. I'm going to bring Laura in, because Laura has said in the chat, if there is time, she also has a question for Raphael. You might, before I pass over on that question, Yanina has put a feedback form in the chat. In the last few minutes, if you wouldn't mind filling that out, it's massively helpful to us to know how you found the session, both from a Youth Endowment Fund perspective, but also from our presenters, who are all of us are looking to improve at any given time. So we'd love to get your feedback. So if you get a chance to fill it out right now, or immediately after, or soon after the end of the session, would be highly appreciative. But going to Laura's question, Raphael, this is out of our support that came through in other evaluations. Is this something that you see in your programme? How extensive is it, and how is it managed to support therapist caseloads?
Really interesting question. I know that in multisystemic therapy, there is this sort of offer of a 24/7 hotline, as it were, to the therapist in case of any challenges and issues. I suppose FFT is maybe a little bit different in that so there's very high flexibility in the availability, like in when therapists are arranging sessions and being available for families. But in some ways, we're trying to convey the sense. I'm thinking particularly when you're trying to practice skills with families, that that they can do it, and you want to build in. So it varies depending on the phase. In the very early phase, you want to get in as quickly as you can, and you might build in sessions one after another for the first week or first 2 weeks, first 3 weeks, to build credibility and buy-in. And then as time goes on, you're more trying to communicate to the family, you know, we believe you can do this. You know, this skill we've been going through, this is the perfect skill to use at this point. And I think there's also very close collaborating with the system around the child and the family to make sure that if there are any additional needs that we're linking them in quickly and facilitating those linkages, I suppose. So it is slightly different from, I think, the sort of MST model. But again, I think it's very phase specific in terms of the intention and goal that the therapist is aiming towards. Yeah, so hopefully, again, that offers some way of answering that question.
I just wanted to add to that as well, in terms of having the RCT structure on top of FFT. That flexibility in meeting with the families also applies to us in the research team. So in terms of meeting the family after school or after work during the week, we've tried to kind of reduce that as a barrier for the research, to apply the same approach as FFT and sort of our availability to conduct those baseline assessments and follow-ups. So that's kind of another.
And I guess I'd say that there are significant resource implications to that model, right? Both from both sides. So I think that's just also a reflection about, you know, where are you doing an evaluation and what setting are you doing the evaluation? What are the needs of the families who would like to be in the evaluation? And sometimes that just involves a lot of people doing a lot of hours, going out and meeting people where they want to be met, which is obviously just involves a big resource.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our session. Thank you again to our fantastic presenters, Laura, Raphael, Helen and Sajid, and also to you as the audience. So we hope that you've really got something out of today's session, and we thank you for attending. Do signpost colleagues and associates to the presentations and the slides on the Youth Endowment Fund website. They won't be immediately up, but as soon as Janina gets a minute, she will get them uploaded for you. And please do fill out the feedback form as well. We'd really appreciate that. So we'll close now, and it just remains for me to say have a great afternoon. Bye, everybody.